Hello, this is Dr. Kathy Millhauser with a short lecture on organizational change. The last few decades have been characterized as a time of accelerated change and evolution in the global workplace. Globalization, the revolution in information technology, and other trends impacting the world of work are linked with dramatic changes in the way all of us will experience the workplace in coming years, and that change is already underway. The idea that we are becoming more and more able to connect diverse societies and geographies toward the accomplishment of business and commerce is one that has been evolving for centuries. Recent decades have only served to accelerate that progress, as technology has facilitated the flow of information and knowledge related to what is possible, as well as paved the way for us to engage in exchange with people distant and diverse from ourselves. Experts agree that technology has accelerated our ability to interact as a global society in many aspects of our lives, and has specifically facilitated the accomplishment of business across geographic boundaries. Whether a business leader or owner is directly impacted by globalization or other forces in the changing world of work, most would agree that the ability to respond quickly to shifting circumstances becomes increasingly important as organizations strive to remain competitive. This lecture will introduce you to some basic theories about change and the researchers who have developed them. We will not go into depth on any of these theories or theorists, but this lecture should provide you with enough information to do further research yourself. It is my hope that these theories will help you and your organization adapt to the needs of tomorrow's global business environment. The early 1940s appears to be the time frame when a distinct focus on change began to emerge in the social and management sciences, specifically from the work of Kurt Lewin. Although many business students have never heard of Kurt Lewin, he is considered the founder of modern social psychology. His most famous research was conducted during World War II, when he worked with women in the U.S. to understand how to influence people to change their eating habits to adapt to wartime needs. Basically, the housewives who participated in his study had the attitude that only certain cuts of meat were good enough to feed to their families. They rejected any type of meat they considered to be unfit for human consumption, which was a problem in a time when food was scarce. Lewin found that before people would become willing to accept a new way of thinking, they had to let go of the old way, and that this process was often very difficult. When faced with the challenge of accepting a dramatic new way of thinking, people would often exhibit learning anxiety. Learning anxiety is basically a fear that learning something new will either be too hard or that it will cause the person to have to reform their identity, which is very uncomfortable. Lewin also found that when people understood the dangers in their old way of thinking, they would often develop a survival anxiety. Survival anxiety is the realization that if a person does not change their thinking, they will lose something essential to their identity. Lewin next developed the theory of how to help people through change by analyzing the factors that contributed to both the survival and learning anxieties, which became the basis for his force field analysis method. Force field analysis is a process of analyzing a problem in terms of the driving forces that support the change and reduce the survival anxiety, and the restraining forces that resist the change, fueled by learning anxiety. Lewin found that adjusting the situation so that the driving forces were stronger than restraining forces was important, but also that people would resist change if they were pushed too hard or too fast. The real breakthrough that Lewin made was when he discovered that focusing on reducing learning anxiety, reducing the restraining forces, was more important than increasing the driving forces. In other words, he worked on helping people overcome their fear of learning something new. And even more notable is that Lewin found that this was not an individual problem, but a social one. This came about after Lewin had worked with his group of housewives for some time and had helped them to accept that they could use the less attractive pieces of meat in their cooking. But then when they left the research study and went back to their community, they reverted back to their old way of thinking. Eventually, Lewin found that he needed to work with the whole community through the process of experimentation and social support before the change would stick. This realization resulted in the development of Lewin's action research approach, which is a method many researchers in the social sciences rely on to this day. We will now focus on Lewin's work specific to change. This slide illustrates the progression of Lewin's work, resulting in his three-step change process. This model was developed as an outcome of Lewin's work on group dynamics, action research, and force field analysis. Throughout his work, Lewin concluded that there were 3 steps in the change process. First came the process of unfreezing, wherein the previously established behaviors needed to be altered so that a change in behavior was possible. This was a step where he focused on inducing the survival anxiety so that people would realize that they must change. This process is also referred to as disconfirmation, disconfirming the old way of thinking. Lewin found that once the old way of thinking was unfrozen, people were much more open to new ideas. The next step in Lewin's process was the movement from the previous frozen set of beliefs and behaviors to the new beliefs and behaviors required by the change. Again, this process required a community-wide approach so that the new beliefs and behaviors would be sustainable over time in the real world. Lewin found that involving the housewives in designing the change would help them to develop a sense of ownership and further reinforce their new identity. At this point in the process, Lewin focused on reducing learning anxiety by building support for people through mentoring and peer coaching, as well as the use of strong role models. The last step in Lewin's process was the refreezing, when the new behaviors were cemented in alignment with the goals of the change. Think of this phase as the process of long-term reinforcement of new beliefs and behaviors back in the communities where the housewives interacted every day. This model appears to have provided focus for how change occurs naturally, and also an opportunity for researchers to begin to explore how to leverage natural processes to affect or drive change at the individual, group, and organizational level. Lewin continued his work based on this model and eventually concluded that the motivation to change was an outcome of the perceptual link between individual needs and external forces. His research indicated that individuals respond more positively to change when they could see the connection to their personal needs and own the change, but they resist external pressures to change that do not fit within the context of their needs. This provided the impetus for other researchers to explore the differences in responses depending on whether change is imposed or induced, and to develop theories and models for understanding individual and group responses. I cover Edgar Schein's work on organizational culture in a different lecture. However, Edgar Schein has done a lot of work to bring Kurt Lewin's change theory into modern use and suggests that leaders act as coaches and create a support system for individuals being asked to change. His research also shows that individual change that is not reinforced by the group and organization does not last. Organizational change that is not reinforced at the group and individual level fails to make sense to people, thus adding to the potential that anxiety will become pronounced and the change resisted. Please view my lecture on organizational culture available on worldischanging.com for the details on Schein's work. William Bridges eventually became the change and transition management theorist that resonated most clearly with organizational business leaders struggling to understand how to cope with the psychological needs of individuals affected by change. Bridges' work became popular in the late 1980s and early 90s. Bridges, like Lewin, also used a 3-step approach to change. His 3 phases were labeled the ending, the neutral zone, and the new beginning. In Bridges' ending phase, people were encouraged to let go of their old way of thinking and believing. This is very similar to Lewin's unfreezing stage. Bridges focused on what managers and leaders could do to help people being asked to change in an organizational setting. He suggested marking the end of an old process with ceremonies and focusing on helping people get closure before asking them to change. The neutral zone in Bridges' model is similar to the middle phase in Lewin's model. Bridges focused more on this phase than other theorists have, asserting that once a person has let go of the way things used to be, they were ready to explore new ideas. He encouraged managers and leaders to give people time to experiment and contribute to the design of the change. His research showed that this phase was the most difficult for people to handle, as they no longer had the old way of thinking and behaving, and still didn't have a new way either. He called this the nowhere between two somewheres, and emphasized that this was a phase when the most creative ideas could be generated because people were not bound by conventional thinking. In Bridges' new beginning, the new way of thinking and behaving has begun. Bridges emphasized that the success that organizations would have in this phase would be dependent on how well they managed the ending and neutral zone phases. He found that most organizational change failures and problems were due to poor endings and mismanaged neutral zones. The next theorist is Irving Janis. Irving Janis defined the term groupthink as a mental model deployed in groups. He defined this as when the members' strivings for unanimity overrides their motivation to realistically appraise alternative courses of action. So what does this mean? To paraphrase simply, Janis found that people need to belong more than they need to be right. As a matter of fact, Janis found that people would conform to a group way of thinking even when they didn't believe in it. So how and when can groupthink happen? Janis found that it was more likely to occur in groups that were closed off or insulated from outside influences and where leaders were not open to change. Kotter is another very popular name in the field of change management, and especially in the leadership of change. Kotter is a Harvard professor who studied change and then created an 8-step process to help leaders become more successful with change efforts in their organization. I would encourage you to study Kotter's 8 steps yourself and look for connections between the theories developed by previous theorists. For example, Kotter's number 1 step is establish a sense of urgency, which might best be done by following Lewin's advice regarding disconfirming the old way of thinking, which he called unfreezing, and which William Bridges called the ending phase of change. Business leaders love a simple, actionable model like Kotter's. It is your job to make sure that the approach is grounded in solid theory and does not become a superficial approach that misses the key elements related to the psychological and social processes in play during change. Organizational change is a process, not an event, and it involves a number of phases. Missteps at one stage can slow momentum and even derail hard-won gains. Declaring victory too early is a common mistake. A change effort may be deemed successful only after individuals are fully committed to the strategy and are not simply complying with the leader's wishes. Once the internal elements of the organization have been modified to align better with the new strategy, the change has the potential to stick. Otherwise, when the pressure for change subsides, many people revert to their old values, attitudes, and behaviors. So, individual change supports group change, which can be leveraged to move an organization to a new place in a system of reciprocity. As individuals change, they can alter the group and organization, which must reinforce what they are learning in order for change to stick. And when change does stick, the environment alters further, leading to further evolutionary internal change. Here is a list of references that I used in this lecture. As you read the works of contemporary researchers like Bridges and Kotter, keep in mind that these popular models have their roots in social sciences research. Helping people adapt to change is a deeply rooted psychological and social problem. You will have a better understanding and appreciation of popular business approaches to change if you understand the theoretical underpinnings that make these approaches work. This concludes my lecture on organizational change. Thank you for your attention.